Over the last 10 years in the United States, we've seen a lot of different diseases and insects show up in soybeans, and I think one of the worst ones you can possibly have in terms of a disease is sudden death syndrome. So we'll talk about how to stop that, or at least how to reduce the problems with sudden death syndrome today.
Well, with many problems that we face on the farm, we see something out there, we have a treatment option or a farming technique that we can utilize, we go out and we fix the problem. With sudden death syndrome in soybeans, there really isn't a fix. Once you're seeing visual symptomology in your field, you just kind of have to let it play out. So that's really a tough thing to deal with on the farm. So where does it really get started? Sudden death syndrome, as many of you well know, starts with a fusarium infection, and an infection often happens within 48 hours, 72 hours of when that seed was dropped in the ground. So you think about it, wow, I got to have some protection right on my seed to begin with. Yes, it does help to have a treatment on the seed, and there's some good options. Levo would be one that comes to mind that's been shown to give some benefit when you have sudden death syndrome out there. But dealing with that cold, wet soil could be an even bigger thing.
Well, the thing I always talk to people about, as soon as they say, I've got sudden death syndrome, I say, how much tile do you have in the ground? You've got to get your drainage problem fixed. Yes, we also want to reduce our compaction issues. So if you have less compaction, you typically have less sudden death because you have a much bigger root system. But you really want to improve drainage in your soil. So if you've had a sudden death syndrome, or if there's sudden death in your area, really work on, in the future, having better drainage. That means more tile.
All right, well, sudden death syndrome has been around long enough that the soybean breeders have started to address it. We see some major differences in tolerance levels to sudden death syndrome between varieties at all maturities that are planted right now in our country. Now, like everything, when you're picking for disease tolerance, you want to make sure that you're getting that disease tolerance, but also getting very high yielding genetics. And many of the soybean varieties on the market today would be able to have both those characteristics, that not only are they good on sudden death, they're great on yield.
All right, Darren mentioned Levo. The other product that has some activity on sudden death is Myrtec. Now, typically what Syngenta is doing is selling their Chloriva Complete together with Myrtec. The Chloriva is for cyst nematode. And what they found is, boy, if we have some cyst nematode control and we have sudden death syndrome control, then you're going to have that much more yield. With Levo, at least that does have some cyst nematode control as well as sudden death syndrome control. With Bayer and their Levo product, they're typically throwing that together with Votivo to add even more SCN control too. So anyway, you basically have two choices here. You've got this Chloriva Complete Myrtec side, and then the other side is Levo together with Votivo.
All right, late in the season, once we start seeing the very first flowers in a soybean field, this is a time where you could provide some extra protection as well. Many farmers are putting on fungicides when we get to full bloom to first pod, R2 to R3. But at R1, when you just see those first blooms out there, you do have a chance for some suppression of sudden death syndrome with Preemptor. Now, when we think about it, we get Preemptor out there, we spray on right at R1, it's going to delay the onset of sudden death syndrome is what we've seen. So it's not necessarily, well, you're never going to see sudden death in your field. That's not the case. But if it can push it off for another couple of weeks or more, your soybeans have a chance to start blooming, start developing pods, and hopefully get a little bit ahead of the disease, because the later that disease hits your crop, the less impact it has.
The last point I wanted to bring up here is in terms of delayed planting. There are a lot of people talking about, boy, I should wait to plant because it seems like the later you plant, the less sudden death syndrome you have. And to some degree, yes, that's true. But the problem with that is when you delay planting, you also lower your yield because early planting typically yields more. So what we normally would suggest to you is plant your most tolerant varieties first and your fields that have less risk, less chance for sudden death syndrome, plant those first. But don't delay planting overall.
Well, sudden death syndrome is a tough disease, and soybeans start with a tolerant variety on your least problemsome fields. Then you can treat it with treatments such as Levo, for example. At R1, you can use something like Preemptor, and then make sure you get your drainage improved this fall. If you've got an issue out in your field, add some more tile lines in those areas to reduce that waterlogged condition that you often see in the spring.
Well, whether you have sudden death syndrome or not, you very well could have our Weight of the Week. We'll tell you how to stop it coming up later in the show.